In a cellar under a naval dockyard are some of the remains of an English warship that mysteriously sank in 1545, taking over 400 people with her. The reason the ship sank has never been fully explained. Over the centuries, the French, the crew, and even the shipwrights have all been blamed for the catastrophe. Only now are archaeologists and scientists beginning to come up with new evidence to explain one of the great disasters of sea warfare: the sinking of the Mary Rose. The day that the Mary Rose sank, England was in crisis. A large French force lay off the Isle of Wight, ready to invade Portsmouth. Among the English ships was the King's own Mary Rose. For years she had been the pride of the fleet and had recently been refitted with the latest weapons technology. On board she was carrying over 90 guns and hundreds of soldiers and archers. That day, Henry VIII had appointed a new captain to the Mary Rose, and as the ships went into battle, the king and the captain's wife stood together on the shore to watch. What happened next has remained a mystery for over 450 years.
The loss of the Mary Rose was so shocking because wooden ships normally didn't sink. The biggest danger in wooden ships in battles at sea was fire and explosion, not sinking. This was dramatic, it was different, and it was terrifying. As sailors didn't learn to swim, its chance of survival was poor. This was unusual and shocking, so unusual and so shocking that it entered the national consciousness and was remembered. This was a real disaster.
As the English ships bore down on the French, all seemed well. The Mary Rose fired her cannon from the port side. And then she set her sails to come about in order to fire from her starboard side, when without warning, she heeled right over, capsized and sank, taking practically everybody on board with her. From his vantage point at Southsea Castle, all the king could do was watch.
It must have been one of the worst things that could happen to him. There is one of his major symbols of his own power. It's been, one of his favourite ships. It had been a flagship. It had attracted plaudits of being the best ship in the Navy, the fastest, the most manoeuvrable, and so its loss in front of his eyes must have been totally traumatic. And not a little embarrassing, I would have thought.
For 437 years, the Mary Rose lay at the bottom of the sea. Her masts were ripped off by early salvage attempts, and the half of her hull that had not sunk into the silt of the seabed gradually rotted away. But by 1982, the largest maritime archaeological operation the world had ever seen began to lift her from the sea. With the future king watching, tenderly they brought the 16th century ship to the surface. Now, the Mary Rose is there for all to see. Her fragile timbers chemically preserved day and night. Over 250,000 people every year come to admire the warship that once belonged to Henry VIII. The raising of the Mary Rose has opened a unique window on the 16th century. With the evidence from the ship safely on the shore, might it now be possible to discover what sank the Mary Rose? To understand what happened that day in the Solent, we have brought together experts in ship science, archaeology, naval history, and sea warfare. This is the first major investigation of the sinking ever undertaken. Our experts will comb through the claims and the theories to try to explain one of the greatest maritime disasters of the age.
There doesn't seem to be any pattern of damage, does there?
One theory they could check out immediately was that the ship had been sunk by cannon fire from one of the French ships.
If we're looking for evidence of the French having struck the Mary Rose, in the hull itself, we can't see anything. There are no big gaping holes where a French shot would have penetrated the hull. But we also had one gun that was situated, the second to the last gun on the starboard side, which appears to have suffered a glancing blow to it, to one side of it, and it's quite a nasty dent.
This is the one that was may have been hit by the French, is it correct?
Well, it certainly looks as though it's had a glancing blow of some sort, possibly, and also its muzzle foreshortened, and I don't know whether it's one episode or 2 episodes. And that's for you to tell me, really.
A ballistics expert was called in to check out the suspect gun.
So what's caused the irregular shape on one side?
It's a very brittle failure.
So it wouldn't have been hit by a shot from the French?
I don't believe so. I think one would have expected to see some evidence of a spherical impression. There's certainly not that. It's rather puzzling, but this definitely isn't impact damage.
But despite the lack of evidence, the experts still can't be sure that French fire had no effect.
We have to remember that we've only got less than half a ship, so we can't say whether any substantial damage happened to the transom at a higher level, the very, very stern of the ship, or whether indeed anything had happened on the port side, which, although unlikely, we just cannot state. So we don't know what amount of damage might have been done.
But even if a French cannon had found its target, would one repairable hole have been enough to sink the ship?
The guns that were carried in the galleys, and I believe it would be a bower, what sort of hole would that make through 14 inches of solid wood?
Well,
5 inches.
Yeah,
5 inches.
depending on the size of the
Yes, a
Yeah,
6.
'cause
A
the
6.
point I'm trying to make is that if you've got a hole that size, is that going to affect it?
Yeah, that's, no, I see what you mean. It wouldn't actually...
There isn't any significant evidence of 16th century ships of this size being sunk by gunfire. And that's sustained gunfire at close quarters. So to sink a ship like this with 1 or 2 hits would be quite astonishing.
If the French hadn't sunk the Mary Rose, what had? Our experts turned to history for clues. When the Mary Rose was built, she was hailed as one of the finest ships at sea. Our experts now believe that the king himself changed that. Just before she sank, Henry VIII ordered a major refit to the Mary Rose. Could that refit be the reason why she sank?
The ship was built to reflect 2 things: the glory of the state and, perhaps more importantly, the glory of the prince that led the state. So this was Henry's ship. It reflected Henry's ideas, and its armament, its design, its decoration all shouted very loudly that this was the product of the Henrysian state. It carried Tudor roses to make sure you knew which dynasty had built it. The Tudor roses were on the ship, they were everywhere. This was very much branded through like a stick of rock.
From the start, the king wanted the Mary Rose to be at the cutting edge of Tudor technology.
Warships in the 16th century were one of the most complex technological feats that man had. In fact, all through the ages, it's often been the leading part of technology. They were the equivalent, really, to the space shuttles of today. And in terms of her strength and endurance, she was a very successful warship. The Mary Rose really was a very advanced ship for her age.
30 years before her sinking, the Mary Rose had excelled herself in another battle against the French. In those days, the Mary Rose was effectively state-of-the-art. At the time, guns on board ships were used as a prelude to boarding and capturing the enemy. The guns had too short a range for sea battles. But long-range bronze cannon were being introduced. Henry ordered that the Mary Rose be fitted with the heavier guns.
any king who expects to go to war, and the idea that he would go without the new powerful weapon is almost unthinkable. This is the thing which really shows that you're in the #1 league, that you've got these guns, and the more the better. So even if you haven't the first idea what to do with them, you've jolly well got to have some.
When the Mary Rose sank in 1545, she was bristling with all the latest weapons technology of the age. But had fitting the new guns damaged the ship? Is that what caused her to sink?
The reconstruction completely reconfigures the ship. So the question then arises whether it was right to retrofit this new advanced technology into a ship that was verging on obsolescence and was by now 30 years old. Henry took that decision and went ahead rearming the ship. It was always going to be interesting to see how she performed.
To find out if the new cannon were responsible for the sinking, the experts now needed to work out how the extra weight of the guns might have changed the Mary Rose. Had it made the ship less stable?
A conservative estimate for the change in ordnance between the Mary Rose as she first sailed during the First French War in 1512 and when she sank in 1545 is between 8 tons minimum and probably 20 tons, which is more likely. And that's quite a dramatic change.
The new guns were affecting the Mary Rose. Keeping a ship afloat and upright is a balancing act between gravity pulling down and buoyancy pushing up. The ability to maintain that balance is a measure of how stable the ship actually is. To calculate the stability of the Mary Rose after the refit, the scientists needed to know the impact of adding the extra weight of the new guns.
The biggest problem we have with any ship at all is knowing where the whole of the weight of the ship acts. That's the centre of gravity. When you design a ship, you need to know the mass of everything on board, and hence you need to know the weight. And so modern techniques, we know how to make a ship stable. We know where the distribution of weight is on board. In the days of 1545 and before, they only had feel. That's the only thing they worked from. People knew about stability, but they didn't know how to calculate it.
But what if the Tudor shipwrights had got it wrong? The scientists now wanted to check if the weight distribution of the ship after the refit had affected the Mary Rose's stability. They started at the bottom of the sea.
During the excavation, a great attention to detail was made to make sure that we know where all the objects come from. So we know which guns were in which position. We know how much shot was by each gun. And that is vital when we come to work out the loading pattern for the ship, because that is what plays such an important part in determining whether the ship was actually stable when she went to sea on that last day in 1545, or whether she was inherently unstable.
81A 2047.
11320.
By painstakingly weighing every available item on the ship, the experts could work out the center of gravity of the Mary Rose.
1990.
The archaeologists even set out to weigh the Mary Rose itself. Could they prove that Henry's ship was dangerously unstable when she set out to fight the French?
In the initial build of the ship, we had the centre of gravity somewhere, and we've got that position there on the ship. And of course, when we do the rebuild in the 1530s, we're adding cannon up here, adding cannon there, we're adding cannon there. So consequently, the centre of gravity has risen. And that is actually something we didn't want. That makes the ship actually slightly unstable.
The experts now knew that the weight of the new guns had made the Mary Rose less stable. But they established that the extra 20 tons by itself was not enough to sink her. Might there have been other, more fatal changes as part of the King's refit?
The evidence for the sequences of major rebuilding on the Mary Rose, in terms of documentary evidence, is a bit fuzzy. But we're beginning to see concrete evidence of structural replacements and repair in the actual archaeology, in the timber evidence of the ship itself.
The experts called in a dendrochronologist to establish the dates of timbers they suspected had been added as part of the refit. If they could find out the full extent of the modifications made to add on the new guns, the experts could then assess their impact on the ship's seaworthiness. It all depended on the wood samples coming up with the proof they needed.
I'm looking for the pattern of changing wide and narrow rings, and that pattern's unique to the time period that that tree grew in. Just recently, what we've found is rather exciting, because we found a frame which is a major element of the ship, for which the last ring of growth that I can find is 1540. So the tree must have been cut down after 1540, which of course is only a couple of years before the ship sank.
The dendrochronology gave the experts the confirmation they needed. The hull of the ship and the main deck had been strengthened to accommodate the new guns. The extra weight of the structural changes would all count against the Mary Rose in the coming battle.
The implications for the handling of the Mary Rose, I think, are inescapable. This is part of a sequence of events that led the Mary Rose to be more unstable after this reconstruction. So I think we have to say that the refit has a lot to answer for.
Fitting the new guns had radically altered the ship. The king could be sending hundreds of men to war on a ship that was no longer truly seaworthy. But was the refit enough to cause her to heel over, or were there other factors as well? To solve the mystery, the experts would have to look at the day of the battle itself, the final hour of the Mary Rose. What had made the king's favorite ship suddenly heel over and sink? The experts were not convinced by the French cannon fire theory, and there was doubt that the refit by itself could explain the catastrophe. They now turned to the day of the battle itself. One of the few clues to the events of that day was kept in a house in Sussex. Sir Anthony Browne, one of the king's favourites and the owner of Cowdray House, sent an artist to record the Battle of the Solent for posterity and to adorn his home. But in 1793, the house and the painting were destroyed by fire. By chance, an engraving had been made shortly before. This is the only visual record of the day, the Tudor equivalent of photojournalism. If the representation is accurate, could it provide our experts with valuable clues to the mystery?
The sinking of the Mary Rose is very clearly shown in the Cowdray engraving. We can see the masts of the Mary Rose up above the water and a number of distressed sailors up on the fighting tops of the Mary Rose, with a number of drowned sailors floating in the waters of the Solent. I've always been very intrigued by the map-like qualities of the Cowdray engraving, and decided to investigate how accurate the image actually might be in its portrayal of the Solent and the events of that day.
To see if the engraving could provide clues to the sinking, the geographer took positions of landmarks on the engraving and compared them with their exact locations on a computer-generated map of the Solent. If the engraving was geographically accurate, it might also be a faithful record of the day itself. Astonishingly, each of the landmarks was in its correct position on the engraving. The Tudor artist's layout was practically flawless.
When I saw this first time, I was quite surprised at how closely it actually matched the viewpoint. It seems a remarkably accurate representation of Portsmouth and the Solent, and the scene there on that day in 1545.
Studying the engraving, our experts could assess the seriousness of the preparations the king had made for the invasion and the level of fear in the country caused by the French threat. Thousands of troops had been assembled on Southsea Common. The Mary Rose and her crew were being caught up in an atmosphere of national panic. The king's divorce from Catherine of Aragon and his attack on Catholicism had left England without allies in Europe. The French king could not resist the temptation to attack. The French fleet was over 200 strong and took up position off the east coast of the Isle of Wight. The English were heavily outnumbered. From the Cowdray engraving, the experts could work out the deployment of the English and French ships. The king had brought together nearly 30 of his own ships, including the rearmed Mary Rose, as well as renting over 80 merchant ships. But Henry was still waiting for many of them to arrive as the two fleets lined up for battle. The French admiral sent in his galleys, large, low vessels powered by teams of oarsmen that didn't rely on the wind. These were the amphibious assault craft of the day, and they were armed.
It wasn't sailing ships that carried heavy guns to sea first, it was galleys. One big, heavy gun mounted in the eyes of the galley, steered by turning the whole ship, firing big stone shot. They'd had guns for a long time. You see, they'd had guns for 150 years at sea. Lots of them, but they were man-killing guns. They were basically just a noisier kind of crossbow. But once you get the galleys taking these heavy guns to sea, then it starts changing everybody's calculations.
The Mary Rose was going to sea in an atmosphere of fear and tension. She was facing a powerfully armed enemy with untried technology. Was the Mary Rose strong enough for the challenge, or was it inexperienced officers and crew that caused her to sink?
There cannot have been any officer on the English side, almost certainly, who had ever commanded a big ship with a significant battery of heavy guns in action before. There cannot have been very many who had ever been fought galleys with ships before. It was all very new.
The Mary Rose was the first out of harbour and the first to face the enemy. She fired her new armament from the port side and then began the manoeuvre that would be her undoing. To line up in position to fire from starboard, she changed her sails and began the fatal turn.
The ship is in a complicated situation. It's under fire from dangerous opponents with heavy artillery. It's manoeuvring and it's trying to reload as it's going. And they're trying to combine all of this into an effective response to a clear and pressing danger that the French will not only defeat them, but will come into Portsmouth Harbour and burn the city and the fleet.
As the ship turned, she began to heel further and further. Finally, she began to capsize. Under the stress of battle, had the Mary Rose made a fatal mistake? Had the crew sunk their own ship? The records of the sinking list as few as 25 survivors. Hundreds of officers, sailors and soldiers died in minutes. Sir George Carew, the senior officer on the Mary Rose, had been appointed Vice Admiral by Henry VIII only hours before the ship went down. In Tudor times, officers were aristocrats, not seamen. They relied on the master and the boatswain to run their ship. After the sinking, Carew's brother wrote that on the very day, Sir George had complained to another ship's captain that he had an unruly crew he could not control.
Presumably, the intention was to exonerate George Carew from mishandling the ship, to try and blame somebody else for it at the time. There's no corroboration of that, and since Carew himself was drowned in the sinking of the ship, it's not surprising that there's no corroboration. Nobody else heard this remark as far as I know. I think one just has to treat that with a pinch of salt.
Over the centuries, the sailors on the Mary Rose have often been blamed for causing the ship to sink. There have been accusations of mutiny by the crew, and of them all having got so drunk the night before they were unable to carry out orders. But what if it wasn't the crew who were unruly? What if it was the Vice Admiral himself?
Indiscipline doesn't just mean the mariners, it could mean the captain.
But the English accounts suggest, doesn't so much suggest that Carew's at fault, but the Carew account suggests that it's his men at fault, isn't it?
But that's a Carew account.
Yes. That's a Carew, yes. These are gentlemen officers who are overruling the opinion of the ship's masters, the professionals, and engaging a disciplined enemy in an indisciplined way. So this indisciplined thing may well not be Carew having a problem with his mariners, it may be Carew's indiscipline, which has placed the ship in a dangerous situation, a militarily dangerous situation.
If the ship's command was weak, did that help to explain the sinking? Was there a serious mistake in the handling of the ship? The Mary Rose sank while she was turning to fire from her starboard side. Could water have somehow got into the ship while she was coming about? Our experts suspect it had. As part of the King's refit, the archaeologists believe that new gun ports were cut low down in each side of the Mary Rose.
If we want to introduce new, heavier guns, it means introducing gun ports into the hull. And if these 4 main gun ports, if they're introduced at the rebuild, they need the lidded ports, but when they were doing manoeuvres, they would certainly have had to close them. Leaving them open before one of the manoeuvres would certainly have been a very bad mistake.
Had that mistake caused the sinking? Had the gun ports been left open? A coded message written by the Imperial Ambassador to England, Francis van der Delft, supports that theory. Delft had interviewed one of the survivors from the Mary Rose. Within days, the secret report was decoded for His Majesty Charles V. Delft told the Emperor that according to the survivor, as the Mary Rose turned, her gun ports had been left open, and as she heeled over, water had entered, flooding the ship. When the archaeologists recovered the Mary Rose, all the main deck gun ports were fitted with lids. To their surprise, the lids were found open, indicating that they could have been open before she sank. Water getting into a ship is every sailor's nightmare. The British Navy today invests heavily in training crews to breach holes in ships. 1 cubic meter of water weighs a ton, and once that extra weight is on board, stability problems multiply. The extra guns and the potential for confusion were already putting the Mary Rose at risk as she went to battle. Open gun ports would have added yet another opportunity for disaster. The angle at which the ship heeled as she turned to fire would push the gun ports right down to the waterline. Water entering the decks through the open gun ports would seal her fate. The ship would have been swamped by the sheer mass of water. But why would experienced seamen have been so inept? Why would they have forgotten to close the gun ports? Seamen make mistakes. It was leaving the bow doors open that sank the Herald of Free Enterprise. 200 people lost their lives as the sea rushed in. The parallels with the Mary Rose, nearly half a millennium before, were desperately clear. Like the sailors on the Herald of Free Enterprise, the Mary Rose sailors could simply have neglected to close the gun ports. In the loss of the Mary Rose, the open gun ports, like the refit, have a lot to answer for. But these factors still don't explain what finally made the ship heel over to her death. The experts now looked at the evidence from the crew itself. Some of the skeletons had been preserved with the half of the ship that sank into the seabed. Many of the men had been unable to get off the ship because of the way it was designed for war.
The reason why many of the men were trapped was because the ship had anti-boarding netting stretched over the exposed decks. This served to keep off the enemy. In this case, it also served the purpose of trapping the men who were on, because they couldn't hack through it quickly enough to get off. Oh, I think it must have been absolutely horrendous.
Even though the experts knew how the men had died that day, they still did not know why. Was the number of men on board the missing factor in causing the Mary Rose to sink? On her way to fight the French, one of the best ships in the English fleet had suddenly heeled over and capsized. There was no thorough investigation at the time, but today's experts are uncovering clues to the mystery of the sinking of the Mary Rose. The experts wanted to know how many men sailed from Portsmouth that day. Their weight and their exact position on board could play a part in explaining why the ship had suddenly heeled over. The official crew size was 415 men, but many of the skeletons had been simply washed away.
We have a minimum number of 179 individuals based upon a skull and mandible count. So we count the number of skulls and the matching jaws that go with the skull when they'd all been matched together. And that gives us a minimum number of 179. Now, we don't know which arm or leg bones go with which skulls. So we counted all the pairs of bones as well, and we got a minimum number of 119 based upon the humerus. So that gives us a final total minimum number of 179. So it's a very good sample.
In the official list of the time, the Mary Rose set sail with 200 mariners, 185 soldiers, and 30 gunners, making a total of 415. We asked 415 Portsmouth schoolchildren to stand in for the crew and to use their playing fields as the deck area of the Mary Rose. Knowing where the various sections of the crew were located when the ship started to turn would indicate if the men themselves had contributed to the way the ship heeled over. The lower parts of the ship would have carried some 60 men. They would have been doing the cooking and the steering. The main gun deck would have carried 90. The vast majority of the men, however, would have been on the upper deck and the two castles at either end of the ship, waiting for their confrontation with the galleys. This loading was yet another recipe for disaster.
This is a model of the Mary Rose, a good representation of the underwater shape of the Mary Rose. It's made out of foam, and you'll see on the ship itself the load waterline, the waterline it should sink to. And so what we had to do is first of all load it up so it's actually at that waterline. And now we'll put the final two weights in just to trim it so it's at the right waterline along the whole length. You'll see it's there, and it's stable. Now I can make that ship very unstable by changing where we put all those people, those men, which we're representing by these very crude lumps of lead. So we'll put some weights up there, put some weights in the forward castle. It's exactly as the Mary Rose was probably sailing on that day. The ship is so unstable I can't hold it.
The distribution of the men was making the Mary Rose even more unstable. And what if the 415 figure was inaccurate? Other accounts of the day say the ship was carrying up to 700 men. New evidence does indicate that there were more men on board. A list produced for the King just weeks before the sinking gives the crew size and tonnage of 29 ships. The numbers of men on each ship in the list is closely related to each ship's capacity. The tonnage of the Mary Rose, the measure of her capacity, is given in another record as 800 tons. From the figures in the King's list, The experts worked out that the Tudor officials had used a simple formula. The number of men for each ship equals precisely 3/4 of the tonnage. The Grace à Dieu, for instance, was listed as 1,000 tons, and her crew 3/4 of that, 750. If that formula was applied to the 800-ton Mary Rose, the number of men would have been 600. We now have a new theory to add to the causes of the sinking. The Mary Rose may have taken an additional 200 men to battle.
I'm sure that the officers would have taken on board as many men as they could find and cram into her, partly because they're expecting to fight a battle hand to hand, and broadly speaking, the more men the better. Also, the number of soldiers you bring with you is an index of your status and importance, and these people are not going to hang back in bringing as many men to war as they can manage to collect.
Given the need for extra fighting power, the experts believe if there were additional men, they may have been soldiers, and they would have been carried on the fighting decks, the highest parts of the ship, and that was going to cause more problems with stability.
When we put a fighting man on board a ship, we need to know the mass of that man, the weight of the man. Modern estimates for a man on board with all armaments is about 100 kilograms. So every 10 men is 100 times 10, 1,000 kilograms, a ton. So if we surmise that on the Mary Rose they put an extra 200 men on board, it's 20 tons of men. And we're putting those men high on the ship. We're putting the men in the wrong place. There's nothing to counteract them down below. 20 tons, of course, acts to sink the ship down as well at the same time. So we're doing two things. One, we're putting the centre of gravity higher. We're also sinking the ship down. Consequently, the gap between the guns, the gun port and the waterline is reduced, and also we've made it a bit more unstable.
The experts believed that the Mary Rose was probably in a dangerous situation from the moment she left the harbour. Pushed down by the weight of her guns, and perhaps extra soldiers as well, and with her gun ports probably wide open close to the waterline, once she started to heel, nothing would save her. But the experts still had one final question. What had caused the Mary Rose to heel so far? The evidence from a survivor introduced a new theory.
Van der Delft claimed, who was the Imperial ambassador, claims to have spoken to a survivor who said that precise moment a gust of wind which had not been anticipated suddenly caught the ship, causing it to heel a little further than it would normally have done. Combination of the sharp turn, the open gun ports, the extra weight in the castles, and a sudden gust of wind just critically upset the balance of the ship sufficiently to cause the water to start to come in.
In the end, could the fate of the Mary Rose have been decided by a gust of wind? To find out, the experts needed to establish the precise route of the Mary Rose as she left Portsmouth in 1545. The route from the harbour, shown on the Cowdray engraving, was transferred to a modern sea chart of the Solent, and that path was in turn superimposed onto a 16th century seafarer's map. The experts could then see the ancient channel that the Mary Rose had taken to confront the French galleys. They now had both the direction of the Mary Rose and, as the wind was powering her sails, the direction of the wind when the ship began her fatal turn.
Given that there was a northerly breeze blowing, the crew would have been told to prepare to change course and to adjust the sails accordingly.
Using a modern sailing boat, our experts demonstrated the impact of a sudden gust of wind during the turn.
This would have created quite a considerable heel, more than we've actually done today, because the vessel stability wasn't as good as this one, but the gunwales are nearly awash here, so certainly at this angle of heel, the water going into the gun ports would have finally caused the vessel to literally slide under the water.
What the evidence is showing is that by the time it sinks in 1545, enough things have happened for it not really to be the same ship. So various things have actually increased the centre of gravity, have effectively reduced the margin for error.
It's quite I think that's a very good way of putting it, in fact. It's reduced the margin for error.
The accident is a consequence of the complex of circumstances within which she finds herself and the dangerous condition of the ship. Everything that could go wrong has ended up going wrong, and it happens right here at this moment under these circumstances, and that's why she sinks there and then.
Our experts now suspect that it was not one single factor that caused the Mary Rose to sink, but a combination of many. The ship could have faced technical problems of stability caused by both the King's refit and by loading extra men on board. If the gun ports had been left open, the situation could well have been made worse by the fact that the extra weight was reducing the distance between the gun ports and the water. Finally, in the confusion of fighting a new kind of sea battle, for which the officers and men were not prepared, the Mary Rose could have been prey to an act of God, the wind. The final stage in the investigation was to put the experts' theories to the test. Channel 4 commissioned a scale model of the Mary Rose and set about finding out how it would sink. This is the first time our experts have seen the Mary Rose as she was in Henry VIII's reign.
Are you happy with that one?
They actually look quite high above the waterline there, don't they?
Well, I mean, that's the waterline, yeah. As you say, John, that, heeling it over, what, 15 degrees?
About 15 degrees, this ship would start flooding through the gun ports.
The total weight inside the ship has to be the displacement of the ship at the scale we're dealing with, which is about 25 kilos. The scale of the model, you've got 30 scale, Alan?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, 1 to 30, yeah.
1 to 30. So we have to make sure we have a 30th scale weight, and that's not just 30th scale, it's 30th cubed, because the weight works.
91 guns in total. This is a culverin from the bow, so that's a bronze muzzle loading gun. And then we have one of the 12 port pieces, which go in at the gun port on the main deck. These weigh about a ton on their carriages, and then another 200 kilos for the breeches. The demi-culverin in the stern here, which is another bronze muzzle loader. It's only the main deck guns put on. Once you get the upper deck ones, which then the 30 swivel guns on top, she's going to be, as they say, bristling with guns, I think.
Got it. It's accurate replica. I mean, it's 1 to 30 scale, so everything we've taken from information given to us by the Mary Rose Trust, we've basically scaled everything from that and made it as accurate as we could produce it. I would think you won't get any more accurate than this sort of model at the moment.
The model was about to undergo tests in the same tank used to investigate the sinking of the Herald of Free Enterprise.
All right. Okay, keep going forward. That's it. Down. Clear? Yeah.
The first thing the experts wanted to know was, would the model sail with all her new weapons on board, just the way she was after Henry VIII's refit? Had the Mary Rose sunk simply because the King's refit had made her unstable?
I can wait for the wind to get up to speed, and then we'll let it go.
Even with the extra guns on board, and all the changes to her structure, the new Mary Rose sailed well. She had passed her first test. But how would she cope with a turn? Would the extra weight of the guns push the gun ports far enough down to let the water in?
Cross fingers.
She came about in style. The new guns and the open gun ports were still not causing the model to sink.
That was a tight turn.
Yeah, it was. That's about 4 ship lengths.
Yeah.
But there was more to come. There was still the theory of the extra soldiers for the battle.
Right, what we've got now is the extra men that were on board. We've been put on board for the 1545 skirmish. We put them up here because they were army. They were on the top because they were going to be fighting. Put some back here because there was space for them. We've got to find the space for 185 men in total, making a total of 415 plus 185, 600 men. And then we'll put on the remaining men on board, which are these here, the crew and the sailors. And then we're set and ready to do our final test. Hopefully it will sink. Go forward, 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 that's it, down.
This could have been just how the Mary Rose went to battle that day. Heavily armed, gun ports wide open, and all the extra soldiers high on the ship. All that was needed now was a gust of wind. If the model sinks, the expert's theory will be validated. If it doesn't, a 450-year-old mystery will remain unsolved. What sank the Mary Rose in the end was a combination of a king's arrogance and a gust of wind. The ship was so deformed by Henry's demands that she could not cope with a simple change in the weather. Soon after the Mary Rose sank, Henry VIII died. By the nature of things, the Mary Rose went into obscurity, while the king was transformed into legend. Only now, 450 years later, is it possible to understand what sank the Mary Rose.
That was the last in the current series. A selection of the Secrets of the Dead mysteries are now available as a Channel 4 book, priced $16.99. Next up, A Blaze of Destruction follows the terrible two of Twin Town in the Monday night movie.